Alright students of Debate Kansas City, Gabe Cook here, and I'm going to be talking to you about how to give the first negative rebuttal as part of our continuing series, The Speeches of Policy Debate. This is the first rebuttal speech that happens, and there's one thing that you need to keep in mind about rebuttals. It's not a place for new arguments. It's a place for extending, building, and rebuilding arguments that you have already made in the debate round. Now, new arguments does not mean if you haven't made this particular argument before in the debate round, you can't make it. When we say new arguments, we mean that you can't create brand new positions. So, for example, if in the first negative constructive, I didn't read any disadvantages, in the first negative rebuttal, I couldn't suddenly drop an economy disadvantage on my opponent. That's considered too late in the debate round. The constructive speeches are where you lay out your main arguments. The rebuttal speeches are where you hash out whose main arguments are best. So keep that in mind. The first negative rebuttal is not a place for brand new arguments. You can read new evidence, you can give new explanations, you can respond to other teams' arguments in new ways. The other team's arguments, I should say, in new ways. But you're not going to be creating new positions or dropping new arguments on your opponent. That's generally considered unfair. Alright, so now let's go ahead and check out 5 steps for how to give an effective first negative rebuttal, or the 1NR. Step number 1 is the same as a step we saw in the 2NC speech. Plan the block. Before the 2NC even talks, you, as the first negative speaker, want to consult with them and say, we've made these major arguments. Which ones are you going to extend and explain? Which ones will I extend and explain? So before this speech happens, before your partner's speech happens, you will have planned out the block. It's very important. We don't need to go into too much greater detail there because I've already talked about that quite a bit. But remember, you've got this huge chunk of time. You're going to have a constructive speech and then a rebuttal speech, and the affirmative doesn't get to say anything in between. So you want to plan out the best possible use of that time, and it can really help you and put pressure on the first affirmative rebuttal. Now, let's check out step number 2. Use your prep time wisely. After you give the first negative constructive, you're going to hear the 2AC, and those are the arguments that you're going to want to be answering. So you need to flow the 2AC, because remember, you're going to answer some of the arguments in the 2AC, your partner's going to answer some of the arguments in the 2AC, but you still want to flow them all out. Alright, so the 2AC will have spoken. Then your partner's going to give the second negative constructive, and that's going to take 5 to 8 minutes depending on the times of the tournament. So already you have a lot of prep time. Then you're going to have a cross-examination period involving your partner but not yourself. So there's another 2 or 3 minutes of time that you have to write out this speech. So what should you be doing with this time? Well, in addition to making sure you have all the arguments from the second affirmative constructive and knowing what ones your partner expects you to respond to, you want to read through the evidence the other team has used. You want to write out all the arguments that you plan on making in your speech so that you have nearly every argument scripted. You want to look for any flaws in the logic. You want to look for any arguments from the first negative constructive that maybe the second affirmative didn't quite answer. And if you have an argument that went unanswered, you can stand up and say, Judge, the second affirmative constructive didn't get to this argument. That means it's conceded in this debate round. Here's why it's important. Here's why it matters. So you want to use your prep time to really plan out the speech. Now let's check out step number 3. You need to talk to the 2NC after they've given their speech. Here's why. I've told you that you try to plan out the block, divide it up. Well, let's say that your partner missed a few of the arguments you expected him or her to take. If that's the case, you don't want to just leave those arguments out there. You don't want to say, well, the 2NC didn't get to it, so I guess we'll just let the affirmative keep these 3 or 4 really good arguments and we won't bother to respond to them. That's not going to work out. So what you want to do is say, look, partner, any arguments that you missed? Do you have anything that I need to cover before I get to all the things that I scripted out? This little bit of communication can really help you, because if you miss an affirmative argument, I guarantee they're going to use it against you. So make sure that the second negative constructive stuck to the plan and answered all the arguments they need to. If they didn't, you're going to have to adjust your speech a bit. That leads us into step number 4. Hopefully everything's gone well, your partner covered all the arguments that they needed to, and you can really turn up the pressure on the 1AR. I've mentioned the block. You have a time advantage, which means if you put out more arguments and more arguments and more arguments, it's going to be difficult for the first affirmative rebuttalist to cover them all. So you put incredible pressure on the first affirmative rebuttalist by making a number of arguments, and that doesn't mean you just say anything, you just argue whatever. You need to be making good arguments. But if you can make extra arguments and find ways to put pressure on them, and make a number of sound arguments in a number of different places on the flow, you can really pressure the first affirmative rebuttalist. They may even be arguments that you're not necessarily winning the debate round on, but you know that the other team has to answer them. So try and pressure them so that you really use that time advantage. Now let's go ahead and check out our 5th and final step. Extend and explain. In addition to making a number of arguments to putting so that you put pressure on the first affirmative rebuttal, the way you want to make those arguments and to deliver them is to take arguments you made from the first negative constructive and extend them and explain them. It's a concept I've covered when I talked about the second negative constructive. In the first speech, you generally give us a shell or a shorter version of the argument. In your rebuttal, you take that argument and you blow it up and you make it bigger. You tell a story that the judge can understand with the argument, the way the parts work. You compare your argument to arguments made by the affirmative and explain why your arguments are more important than theirs. You extend, you explain, you develop so that the judge has a very clear picture of what you're arguing in the debate round. All right, so quick recap. Step 1, we want to plan the block. This is happening early on. Step 2, we want to make sure that we use prep time wisely. This speech has more time than any other in terms of prep time, so make sure that you use it to your benefit. Step 3, find out if the second negative constructive deviated from the plan, if they missed any argument that you need to cover at the beginning of your speech. Step 4, try to put some pressure on that 1AR because it's going to make it more difficult for him to answer your arguments, and potentially it's going to leave you all opportunity to win the debate round with dropped arguments by the 1AR. Step number 5 is extend and explain positions that you made in the first negative constructive. Hopefully these tips are helpful and can lead to a very good first negative rebuttal. Thanks. Gabe Cook for Debate Kansas City. Take care.